webinar. I am Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and this is Mark Translation Notes, Mark 15:6 through 15. This is the second part of this passage where the crowd incited by the chief priests demands basically that Pilate release to them Barabbas over Jesus. So this is part two, following up on what we did Friday. So we'll review the beginning part of the passage and then we'll move through the rest today. If you have not attended one of these translation notes webinars in brief, what we are after is understanding the lexical and grammatical questions that come up when translating the Greek text. So what does this word mean? Why is it used here? How is it used? Why this inflection, this part of speech, and then also the grammatical questions that come up. Why are these words structured in this way? Questions of word order, and how do we move from Greek to English in a way that is both faithful to Greek and readable and understandable in English. All of the previous notes from these sessions are at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes, including today's handout. So if you are watching this afterwards on a recording, you can access this handout that you see on my screen at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. That takes you to a shared Google Drive where you can access this and all the other handouts from the series. I put my email address there as well if you want to reach out, abramkj@accordancebible.com. Let's begin with some review. This is Mark 15:6 through 11, so we'll start there. I've got text open here. We can see how long the passage is. Here's verse 6, here's verse 15. So we got through about this much last time. And so we'll review that just in English and then continue translating from Greek to English with the rest of the passage. Verse 6, now at the feast, he, Pilate, would release to them one prisoner whom they requested. And the one named Barabbas was imprisoned with the insurrectionists, who in the insurrection had committed murder. Then the crowd came up and began to ask him to do for them what he usually did. And Pilate responded to them, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? For he knew that it was on account of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that instead he would release Barabbas to them. So now we go back to Pilate today in verse 12. I'll start with the Greek and we'll go from there. Let me switch over to Accordance for this. So here's verse 12. I'll make the font a little bit bigger. We have ha de Pilatas, palin apokrithes, elegen autois, ti un thelete, poieso, han legete, tan basileia ton Iudaion. And if we go left to right, we get and or but or now, or this could be an untranslated, much like Kai. Pilate, ha Pilatas, again, answering, said to them, what therefore do you want that I should do? That's the subjunctive. With the one called, or with the one you call, legete, so second plural, the one you call the King of the Jews. Here's how I've translated it. And Pilate again answered them, what then do you want me to do with the one you call the King of the Jews? And I just note here right off the bat that we get a construction that we saw already used of Pilate, something very similar earlier in the passage, and that Mark and other Greek writers use throughout. That is a participle with an indicative verb introducing direct speech. So in this case, we have answering, that's the participle. He said to them, that's the indicative verb. So if you want a left to right kind of translation, it's answering, he said to them. That is redundant in English, and so we can just say he answered them and then go comma quote, which of course we don't have punctuation or quotation marks in Greek, so we understand it that way. There are two textual issues here that's reflected by the brackets above. This is in the Greek text. I've opened today the NA28 Greek text with sigla, and so we can see the notations here. And the brackets, in short, mean that the editors of the NE28 weren't sure if this belonged in the surface text. And so they kind of split the difference by putting it in brackets. They can see as much evidence for including it as not. And it's not that they're writing the text, it's that they're trying to reflect what the earliest attainable manuscript or manuscripts would be. And so there are some manuscripts with thelete and some without. And so they weigh all of the manuscripts based on their date and provenance and completeness and reliability and all these things, and they make a decision. And so here you basically split the difference. Now in translation, we can choose to do a certain level of textual criticism. We've got some resources in accordance. We've looked at some of those recently. I tend with brackets to just preserve in brackets in my English translation to kind of reflect the same level of certainty that the editors of the NA28 or the UBS had. You can of course go further and make your own assessment. It's a little trickier in this case to do that though, because if you just have an English text with the variants in brackets, it won't make sense in the way that the Greek does. So you really have to do one or the other. What I mean is this, if I were to read this sentence without the brackets, it would say, what then me to do with the King of the Jews? So if I were to say this thelete, let's say I do my own research and conclude that thelete is not part of Mark's initial text, I would need to change this to something like, what then shall I do? But it's not possible in English, at least that I found, to put both the words in brackets translated into English and to have it read without them in a way that makes sense. So let's look at it with the words. So let's just say for the sake of arguments that we accept these words. Then Pilate's response reads how I have it here. What then do you want me to do with the one you call the King of the Jews? If you think that those are not part of the text, then his quote would read this way. I'm just skipping ahead to the last bullet point for now. Ti un poieso tan basileia ton iudaion. What then should I do with the King of the Jews? And just a couple of directions if you want to go further with this, you can see here in the NA28 text that I've got some notations here. So with thelete, I've got more than just brackets with this text with sigla. So if I click on the degree sign, I've got a list here of manuscripts. And I can even see if I've forgotten what is that degree symbol again. Well, here in the apparatus, it says the word following in the text is omitted by the witnesses cited. So all of these witnesses, and I can use various resources to refresh my memory on what these are, they omit that. Similarly, with han legate, we have this symbol right here, which is like a little, I don't know what you call that, but here it just says the words between these signs are replaced with other words by the witnesses cited. So in this case, we've got han is either there or it isn't. It's either han legate or legate. I will kind of leave that there for now, but we've looked at some of these resources before. You've got Metzger's textual commentary, and you could see he'll comment on both of these. And this C reading basically amounts to it is difficult to decide. And so they include it in the text, but enclose it within square brackets. So you get some of the reasoning behind it. It's not that you, in other words, have to go through all of these manuscripts and go back and see, all right, well, how reliable are these manuscripts deemed to be? You could, but you can also look at a textual commentary like Metzger or Omanson's got a kind of simplified one. And then there is also Comfort as a text commentary. And you could just go to Mark 15:12 and see some explanation about that. So if you want to really spend some time on that, those are some great resources. In translation, I think I don't personally feel super compelled to make a conclusive decision, especially if the expert compilers of the Greek New Testament have not. So I will tend to just bring brackets over. If we say that this is what Pilate said, so if we just go with this particular reading, the thelete is first person, I'm sorry, the thelete is do you want me, or do you want, and then the poieso is the first person subjunctive verb. And verse 9 had a similar construction. We can look at that. We had, again, Pilate answered, or in answering them, he was saying, or he answered them saying, similar construction, do you want that I should release? So you have thelete, do you want, and then a subjunctive, apoluso. So same construction here, very similar wording altogether, just Pilate answering them again and asking, do you want? So thelete, do you want, poieso, subjunctive, first person singular, aorist active, do you want that I should release? Now, we don't really talk that way. If you look at something like the King James, you'll see that subjunctive in a way that reflected English back when it used the subjunctive more. So in the King James, you've got, do you want that I shall do unto him? I think pretty much in every 21st century English translation, you'll see this replacement essentially of the subjunctive with the infinitive in English. So the infinitive gives us a more fluid translation rather than what do you want that I should do? What do you want me to do? So we just understand that even though this is the infinitive in English, it's the subjunctive in Greek, and that's just a matter of usage. But if you're translating, I do like to keep things like the King James or the NASB close for translation, because I can confirm, maybe I'm not using the instant details, maybe I see the sigma and think about the subjunctive. I can confirm that because the King James will bring it out in a way that I can see pretty clearly this is subjunctive. Last comment on this verse, and then I'd love to hear if you've got any thoughts or questions. Pilate prefaces, and this is part of what's contested here textually, although even the legate doesn't seem to be as contested as the Han. Pilate prefaces the title, the King of the Jews, with the one you call, which I think is an interesting way to preface the King of the Jews. Mark has recorded only Pilate in verse 2 and 9 as using that title of Jesus explicitly. That's not to say no one ever called him that. That's not to say they didn't imply that somehow. It's just to say that if you search that title in accordance, and I'll go to the title, I'll highlight it, right click with the text selected, search for lexeme. I'll just add a range here, enter command, range, Mark. It's only on Pilate's lips. And we saw verse 2 a couple weeks ago and verse 9 last week. If you want an English translation, here's one. Pilate asked him, are you the King of the Jews? Pilate asked them, and then he uses King of the Jews. So this title in Mark is only on Pilate's lips so far. So it's just an interesting thing that he says here, and this would be worth looking at some commentaries and trying to figure out is there something I'm missing here, or what's the interpretive significance to this? Probably the simplest explanation is that Jesus has been called mockingly the King of the Jews by the ones that Pilate is addressing. That's not necessarily true, though. So I'm not really sure what to conclude from Pilate's saying of this, except that we do want to bring it out in translation. As far as this legate being a text critical issue, I would just again go to the apparatus, and you see here that the Han legate is replaced in other witnesses by legate. So it's not as if you call is either there or not. It's there. It's just a question of, is this accusative Han there? So I think regardless of what we think in terms of the text criticism of it, we need to bring out the "you call the King of the Jews." Let me just see here. Yeah, and here's one theory, and this definitely gets into the realm of interpretation. Seems to presuppose. On the other hand, however, the insertion of the clause may be regarded as a scribal amelioration introduced in order to throw the onus for the use of the title, the King of the Jews, upon the high priests. And I think that would be interesting to look into more. But again, if we just stick with Mark and what we've got from Mark so far, Mark has only put the King of the Jews title on Pilate's lips. So this is a little surprising. So we just want to pay attention to it, but not hard to bring out in translation. But there is this text critical issue, which probably deserves some further research. So my translation, at least a provisional one in the end, is, "And Pilate again answered them, 'What then do you want me to do with the one you call the King of the Jews?'" So I'll stop there. We get a very short response. They seem to know exactly what they want him to do. But before we get to verse 13, I'll just leave 12 on the screen and see what questions or comments you've got. Okay, here's a good comment. Somebody says, "Note that the NASB does not consistently put all doubtful or added words in italics." Yeah, thanks. And you can see with a simple live click, just make sure that's selected there. Make sure you've got verse lookup selected, click OK, and now click on your verse reference. You can see how different translations treat the text critical issues in particular. And I think the key here is just to be consistent across your translation. Any other comments or questions? All right, let's go to verse 13. Pretty short. Hoi de palin ekraxon, stauroson auton. And that's verse 13. Left to right, we get de again, which in this case I'm not translating, understanding that as pleonastic, but you could say but. Hoi, that's they, but they again cried out, clamored, shouted, "Crucify him." Now in translation, I've gone with "they shouted back, crucify him." So there's an interesting translation issue here with Pauline. I initially translated Pauline as again, because that is a word that it occurs, you can see here, 141 times in the Greek New Testament. So that's a vocabulary word that I tend to hold on to. I tend not to forget. It does not have to mean again, though, even if that's the typical way we might translate it. You do have some other options, and you can see them in BDAG, like to return to a position or state. Again, once more, anew, and then a marker of a discourse or narrative item. Now here, this is interesting. I didn't put this in your handout, but BDAG has a specific sub-entry for this verse, which is wonderful for our work on this word. It's great, because here's BDAG. A special difficulty is presented by Mark 15:13, where the first outcry of the crowd is reported with the words "Hoi de palin ekraxin." Question, is it simply a connective? Is it because a different source is here used, or is the meaning they shouted back? Or is this really a second outcry and the first one is hidden behind verse 8 or verse 11? And then brings in some parallels here. So my first thought would be, I'm going to translate this as again. And I did when I was preparing for today, but I stopped for a minute because when I saw stauroson, I didn't remember researching that yet for Mark 15. And in fact, you would expect, if this is again, to see this word elsewhere. So you can start by searching for the lexeme. And you've got the verbal form staurao. Just jump ahead to Mark here. And in fact, verse 13 is the first time this word occurs. And if we scroll back, I'm kind of short-circuiting this research process a bit, but you could even just do this in English. If we scroll back here in Mark 15, we'll see that in fact, we don't have the crowd crying out, "Crucify him." In fact, I don't think we have the crowd crying out anything just yet, at least not explicitly. Of course, it's possible that they did, but we're just going with what does Mark tell us for right now. So they shouted back, I think works well as a translation. I got that from the NET, and you could see again in BDAG that it had that as an option. So here's the word back, or even here, marker of a discourse or narrative. So, you know, a lot of what's happening here is there's just a back and forth between the crowd and Pilate. So I think the Pauline is symbolizing that back and forth, kind of showing almost as like a discourse marker, that they're just kind of bantering almost back and forth. So you could translate it as, again, I think given the context, just because we don't explicitly have the crowd shouting "Crucify him," and we don't even have the crowd explicitly shouting, according to Mark, I do not go with, again, in translation. I think the NET is good here with shouted back, and that particular definition is attested in BDAG. So it's not as if this word has to mean again everywhere it goes. So that's my understanding of this. And like I said, I'm following the NET here. And I think, again, it's showing that back and forth of the dialogue. Strauss, in his Zondervan exegetical commentary, says the word again in verse 12 does not mean a second time. He just confirms what I could see for myself in the text. This is the first call for crucifixion, but rather in response. And the day is also doing some of that work in these verses. You've got day, hapilatos, in verse 12, day with the crowd in verse 13, day again with hapilatos in verse 14, and day with hapilatos here. And here's another day in verse 14. So the day already is a good discourse marker, almost like it's serving as quotation marks or an indentation, or, you know, when you read a novel and there's quoted discourse, that the text gets offset in a certain way. I think day is already doing that. I think Pauline is doing the same thing here. So they shouted back, or they shouted in response. Now, I have left hoi translated as they, because hoi means they in Greek or in English, but it's not clear, Strauss says, it is not clear in the Greek who the they are, the ruling priests or the crowd. So if we scroll up, we go, who's our most immediate reference? Pilate again answered them, autois. Okay, we still have a pronoun. What do you? Okay, we still not named. Go back up to 11. The chief priest stirred up the crowd. So this is a question of interpretation, I think, not theological interpretation, like grammatical interpretation. The last two references are the chief priests and the crowd. So the they in verse 13 will refer to one of them. Now, I think it's the crowd, just because the crowd is the most immediate referent. The chief priest stirred up the crowd and they shouted, just in a natural sense. I would take that they as the crowd, but you may see it differently. I don't think it's clear either way. Strauss says the latter seems most likely, namely that they is the crowd, though there's little difference since the priests are urging them on. So it's possible that Mark is ambiguous on purpose, or that they're all kind of bleeding into one cacophony, and he doesn't feel the need to specify the they. So the good thing about this is you can kind of leave it at that. Say, I think it's the crowd, it could be the chief priest, it could be both, it could be some combination, I'm not really sure. I think here's a case where preserving the ambiguity going from Greek to English is best, because that's keeping with what Mark did. It may be confusing to readers or to yourself as you're going back to this translation some months later. You might wonder, well, who's the they? I think that's worth a note and a clarification, but Mark is not explicit here. Staurao is used for the first time here. And I mentioned that, we looked at that earlier. Pauline got us thinking about that. So this is a good time for a word study. There are a number of ways you can do this. You can triple click on the word to see it in your default lexicon. You could also, as I trust you know, right click and search for the lexeme and see it in context. So again, just to confirm, that's the first time it's used in Mark. We could right click and go to research and search it in all of our Greek lexicons and look at it that way. And this would be worth spending some time on. Crucify, I think, is one of those words that if you've got even a basic familiarity with the Bible, you're going to have a sense of what it means, but it's worth kind of understanding what exactly that is. I don't think there's really a whole lot of other options for how you translate this other than just crucify. I mean, I suppose you could, like BDAG gives the full definition here, to fasten to a cross. So I suppose if you were looking to keep your translation less, I don't know if jargony is the right word, but that if you wanted it to be really immediate and you thought crucify was too hard a word for your read, you could say something like, they shouted back, fasten him to a cross, which, you know, when you say it that way sounds terrible, but so does crucify him. So that's an option you have here. I think crucify is your best bet for translation, but we do want to understand what exactly it is. And so BDAG gives us this very concise physical definition of what it means to crucify. This still probably raises questions about what was the crucifixion, why Jesus, how does that all fit together? I just, for brevity's sake, for now, I put the NET note in there in your handout, which says, crucifixion was the cruelest form of punishment practiced by the Romans. Roman citizens could not normally undergo it. It was reserved for the worst crimes like treason and evasion of due process in a capital case. The Roman historian Cicero called it a cruel and disgusting penalty. So I think we want to understand a few points about crucify and what it is they're calling for. You could think of it as capital punishment, but it's also a particular kind of punishment that leads to death. It's a slow, painful one. It's torture. So I think, again, I'm not sure that comes out explicitly in translation. I think crucify is the best word, but somewhere in the notes, or if you were leading a group study with this, or especially if it was someone who wasn't familiar with this particular story, I think some level of unpacking would be here. And this note sums it up pretty succinctly. I mean, you could certainly do more in terms of what did crucifixion look like in historical context. I mean, if you want to get into the graphic details, you'll find it in your commentaries. So I would just go to info pane. I would maybe start with France on this one and see what he has to say. I did not check him, but I'm sure he's going to have a note on that particular word, as will other commentaries. So I'll leave that as something that could be done for further reading. So again, staurosan, crucify is the translation there. And then again, it's just such an important word to Mark's gospel that we want to understand it and what's behind it. I noted that it's not in Mark yet. So I'm just going to add a range here. So this is its first use. We'll see it again in a minute in verse 14 and in verse 15. So, I mean, it really is kind of the central focus of these verses. But we do want to consider, this is the verbal form. And if I just delete a couple letters and do an asterisk for a wildcard search, or what I could do is search for the root. So the lexeme is going to give me the dictionary form. So I've got a aorist, active, imperative, second person singular. It's going to give me the verbal lexical form if I search for lexeme, but if I search for root, it will give me other words like just scrolling ahead, here's Matthew to Mark 8. And so here ton stauron was listed. So this is the first use of the verb, but Jesus had already said back in Mark 8, if you want to become my follower, if anyone wants to become my follower, they must deny themselves, or he must deny himself, she must deny herself, take up their cross, ton stauron. And so this is very much, it's a metaphor, but I think it's a pretty unmistakable allusion to the crucifixion, however metaphorical he is being. So that's in Mark, but not as a verb yet. So this is a good point, I think, to, on your own, really spend some time with this word, because again, it's going to come up further in the passage. I'm going to stop there for now, though. If you have thoughts or questions or anything to add, I'd love to hear it. You can just type that into the chat, or the questions box, rather. It's not a whole lot of words here. I mean, everybody knew what this word meant. They all knew what the punishment was, but we, of course, are separated by time and space from this particular method. And even when we think about capital punishment or a lethal injection, there might be similarities, but there's a lot of differences. So obviously a word that we want to spend some more time on. What comments or questions do you have, either about, I guess the words we looked at the most were Pauline for again, or shouting back, or staurosan for crucify. All right, on to verse 14. Pilate's not having it. Now, whether this is performative or sincere, Mark doesn't tell us. It's interesting to wonder about. Pilate's a fascinating character. He's fascinated interpreters for 2,000 years. But let's look at the Greek first. Ha de Pilatos, so here's that day again. Elegen autois, ti gar epoiesin kakan. Hoi de perisos ekraxan staurosan autan. We get de for but, or then, or nothing. Pilate said, or it's imperfect, so it could be was saying over and over to them, but Pilate said to them, gar here I think is why, I'll come back to that. What has he done evil? What has he done that is evil? What evil has he done? De hoi, but they, same ambiguous hoi, presumably the same as the hoi in verse 13. But they all the more, perisos ekraxan, cried out, crucify him. So we get the same exact statement. They're just sticking to their guns, and this, in fact, these three words, ekraxan, staurosan, autan, are repeated here exactly. My translation, but Pilate said to them, why, what evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. I mentioned this elegen here from Lego. I've just translated it as, but Pilate said. Strauss, in his Zondervan commentary, says he thinks it's likely an iterative imperfect, meaning that Pilate kept asking. And I think that's very possible. I don't know how we would know for sure, because that imperfect with Lego could just be used of him saying it one time, although there are ways to check this. What I would do is go for search for, how would I do this? Maybe search for the lexeme, and then I might do Lego and then just add a tag so that I search this specifically for the imperfect. So any person, any number, but under tense, I want imperfect. So I'm searching Lego verb imperfect. I can do this in Mark or elsewhere. Let's see. I don't know why I'm not getting more results here. Something's off with this. So as I look at these, I can see some other instances. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. I can decide, are there other instances where Lego in the imperfect is very clearly iterative. I think maybe it will be, maybe it won't. So again, I don't think there's a conclusive answer to this. I think what Strauss says is certainly grammatically permissible. We've seen in recent webinars how the imperfect can have any number of meanings. And in terms of the context, it makes sense. There is this back and forth, and they shouted all the more. And with this day, and the Pauline, it is quite possible, according to the context, that Pilate is saying over and over to them that there's actually a longer dialogue than what is recorded. I don't know that for sure enough to translate it that way, so I've just gone with the maybe safer, just what Pilate said to them. This T gar epoiesin kakan, the UBS Translators Handbooks has a really nice note here. It just gives us this why, what evil thing has he done, and says in such a question, gar means why or how so. So this was a little tricky for me until I saw that note. You can triple click on gar and see, actually you've got 2 hits here. Because I've got my amplify to give me a verse reference if it's there. I actually have the verse reference here. So that's helpful. So here's BDAG. Gar, often in questions where the English idiom leaves the word untranslated, so on and so forth, skip down. Why, what crime has he committed? So it is confirming that use here in BDAG. So if I understand gar as why, then T is what, that poiesin is what has he done that is evil, or what evil has he done? Or it could be, it's neuter and it's a, this is showing it as an adjective and it's a detail. So it could be what evil thing has he done? But I think evil in general, I think that's a fine translation. So again, whether Pilate is asking sincerely or if he's being performative, that's a question for, well, it's a question for all of us. I did not check the commentaries on that, but you could certainly weigh them. I think this would, at some point here in your study, looking Pilate up in maybe doing a search for Pilate across all your dictionaries would be interesting, just to get a picture of the person. Remember when we started with Pilate back at the beginning of this chapter, he just kind of burst into the passage, handed him over to Pilate. This is Pilate's first mention in 15:1, and we did not get much introduction to him. And for whatever reason, Mark, as we have it, just didn't have that concern or that priority. But at some point, this would be worth some background research, I think. All right, so we've got ekroxon again. I just note here, translate consistently with verse 13. So if you translated it before as shouted, it should be shouted here. If you had it as cried out before, it should be cried out here. If at all possible, the fact that these 3 Greek words are the same, I think you want to translate them the same in English each time, just to show that that repetition is there at the word level. The interruption to the repetition is perissos. So we had hoide Pauline ekroxon, and now we have hoide perissos ekroxon. So it is almost identical except for that, which is an intensifying word. Perissos, I'm going to triple click that. It's an adverb. Here's BDAG, marker of exceptionally high degree on a scale of intensity, like off the charts, exceedingly, beyond measure. Very, which, you know, after all of this, the word very sounds almost a little weak. So there are a number of different ways you could translate this. The adverb perissos, the question is, if it's an adverb, what verb is it modifying? Well, it's modifying them shouting out. So I went with the, I mean, this is not super vivid, but just all the more, because I think that brings out the intensifying nature of it. I like what NET did with this, the New English translation. They shouted more insistently. It could be that they were trying to be more persuasive. It could just be that their shouting was louder. or that they shouted faster, like the rate of their speech was faster. It's not exactly clear in what way this was intensified, but it is pretty clear that if this scene is already a real cacophony, and if it's really chaotic, it's getting more so here. I mean, Pilate, whatever his intentions are, is asking a question that seems to invite conversation or reasoning, and they're just shouting him down. In fact, you might even think about shouting down as part of your translation, because they are just really not interested in dialogue here. So Pilate is going to respond to their lack of interest. They're just not moving their position at all. Mark's showing us that with the verbal, or the word repetition. They cried out, "Crucify him," and it's intensifying with the perissos here. So we'll go to verse 15 in a minute, but let me pause there and see if you've got questions or comments as you take a moment to formulate those. You might even live click verse 14 and see some different options here. The ASV, they cried out exceedingly, all the louder, even louder. They shouted riotously. They shouted all the more. That was my translation. It may be a little boring, but I mean, it's okay as the translation goes. They shouted, "Crucify him all the more exceedingly," is the King James. So that's a decision to make. But the important thing here is the intensifying effect of that. And what's being intensified is their shouting. So it's either more shouting or louder, or it's more and louder. Trying to see if there's any unique translation among the translations I have. Yeah, you're basically getting more or louder are kind of the two variants of translation that I'm seeing there. All right, there's verse 14 on the screen. Happy to hear questions or comments that you've got. Okay, here's a comment just reinforcing what Strauss said about the crowd exchange being iterative with Pilate, both using imperfect tense verbs. This comment says aorist verbs would denote a singular exchange. Bidag, perissos, a scale of intensity, exceedingly beyond measure, various not. The idea of a one-off action requires multiple iterations. Okay, yeah, good point. Yeah, I think that would be some good evidence for this being a repeated thing. Yeah, that's great. All right, well, we come to really the payoff's not the right word. The climax of the passage is verse 15. So up until this point, I just want to pause here and just think about the journey that Mark is taking us on and the rhetorical effect that all this will have. I mean, it's pure chaos, and he's describing it with, chaos can be difficult to describe in words. Mark is describing this pretty specifically, so we do get the actual content of what folks are saying. But especially with this shouting, the clamoring is one possible translation equivalent here. And with this intensifying, I mean, it's just a very chaotic scene. And one wonders, the reader, the listener maybe wonders, what on earth is Pilate going to do to resolve this? Well, we get not only the resolution in verse 15, but we also get his motivation, which is interesting. And again, we can wonder how much was this motivation already present from the beginning? How much was his resistance perfunctory or performative versus sincere? Again, those are great questions to ask. Verse 15 is pretty clear, though, both with Pilate's motive in his final response and then his action. So that's verse 15. Let's look at it in Greek. Hade Pilatos, it's a familiar beginning to a verse by now. Boulamenos to aklo, tachikanan poiesai, apelusen autois ton Barabbas, kai paredoken ton Iesun. We've got fragelosas kinastarote. Left to right, but Pilate, wanting the crowd to do the worthy thing or the satisfying thing. We'll come back to this. That's not an easy left to right thing to do. Released to them Barabbas. By the way, let me just pause here and say that question of hoi before that was not crystal clear who's doing the shouting. I think this would provide some evidence that the hoi is the crowd, because here's who he's interacting with. Mark does name crowd explicitly here. Released to them Barabbas, and handing over Jesus, and he handed over Jesus, flogging him in order that he be crucified. Here's how I translated it. So Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, released to them Barabbas, and after having Jesus flogged, turned him over to be crucified. Now, this is going to, by the way, just set the stage for a pretty, it's a pretty big transition in the book, because now we move to this ultimate event, this crucifixion, although not yet. There's yet more torture before the torture of the cross, which is what we'll come to next time. But for now, he has been sent away from Pilate to the cross. This idiom here, SIL Exegetical Summary Series calls it an idiom, to do what is enough. Ta hikanan poiesai. So this word hikanan, if I triple click it, it can be worthy, it can be sufficient, adequate, large enough. This isn't talking about worthiness per se, it's talking about what's enough. So he wanted to do what the crowd thought was enough, or what the crowd thought was the right thing, or basically he wanted to do right by the crowd. He wanted to satisfy the crowd. So I think this is a good example of, you've got two Greek words, to do enough. We have a great English word for this, which is satisfy. In other words, we don't have to puzzle through how would you render this. I think satisfy is great for translation. You've also got please, pacify is another good word, to content, to do enough for. But here's a longer definition from Loewnida, quoted in the SIL Exegetical Summary Series. It means to cause someone to be pleased by doing what will satisfy him. And again, we could ask the question, I mean, as any curious reader would, why does he care so much about satisfying the crowd, which is an interesting thing to research. But Mark doesn't tell us why, he just tells us that he wants to satisfy the crowd. So we get, again, a look into Pilate's thinking from Mark. And so because he wanted to satisfy the crowd, that's why he released to them Barabbas. And I did not use the word because in translation, but I think you could. The question with the participle is what's its relationship to the main verb. And so if we open up our diagrams, we'll see here's Pilate, the subject at the left of this vertical line. Here are all the verbs in this passage. In boulaminas is a participle coming off of pelusin. So he released Barabbas, wanting to satisfy the crowd. And so you could just bring out explicitly because he wanted to satisfy the crowd. That's one way to treat the participle. This is causal. I'm not sure that this translation here really misses that. I think this is kind of implied, so you could decide what to do with that. But we get a look into his motives. So he released to them Barabbas, and this pelusin, we've had this word all throughout this passage. We'll just do a range here. Just do Mark 15. Verse 6, verse 9, verse 11, and at last verse 15. So the whole question is whom is Pilate going to release? And so here he releases to them Barabbas. So the question is answered and the motivation given. And it says too, back to another participle, he handed over Jesus in order that he would be crucified. But there's another participle coming off of the indicative verb. So if the main verbs are he released Barabbas and handed over Jesus, notice the parallelism there. He's releasing one of them and handing over the other. And they both these verbs have participles. Here it's a participle that has to do with his motivation. But here the participle serves a very different function. from fragellao, to scourge or to beat with a whip or to flog. The question is, what's the relationship of this participle to this main verb? I think it's something like after he had him flogged, he handed over Jesus. It's an interesting question too, this participle here. It does not say that Pilate asked that others would flog him. Just as what do you want that I should do for you? You know, we could expect some kind of construction here with a subjunctive where it would say Pilate asked, you know, the soldiers to flog him. If we take this on the surface, it's possible to read this grammatically as Pilate himself did the flogging. So you could read this as, and after flogging Jesus, Pilate turned him over. In other words, and after he flogged Jesus, Pilate turned him over. There was a translation or two that did it that way. Here's the CNT. This is the Comprehensive New Testament. So Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. So the question there is, did Pilate do it himself or have it done? Well, I don't think that a strict reading of the word itself, even though grammatically it looks like it's Pilate doing it, I don't think that's required, because the idea is that he is essentially responsible for that outcome. Apologies for going to a very mundane example in the midst of such an intense passage, but to illustrate the point, we might say in English, we added on a back porch, even if you didn't lift up a hammer yourself at all. It was construction workers who did the labor, but when you talk to other people about adding on the porch, that's sort of understood. I think flogging is working the same way here. It does not have to mean that Pilate himself did the flogging. This is a good occasion too to look at your commentaries and get a sense of maybe through a Bible background commentary, who would actually do this, who would be responsible for the flogging, and you'll find more on this as you look at your commentaries. So I've gone with after having Jesus flogged, even though strictly speaking, this word could mean Pilate himself flogged him. Most translations do that too. And I'll just close with this. This word itself, fragilosas, from fragilao, if you look it up in the NET translation and BDAG, you'll find a very graphic description, because this flogging is an exceedingly violent and harmful act, to say the least. And I note what's, I think, remarkable about this in terms of what Mark is doing in the narrative is that even before we get to the crucifixion scene, this word, how it's used of Pilate, so directly tied to his name, whether he's doing it himself or handing it over to other people, either way, this word is so closely connected to Pilate in Greek that even if there's some distancing here, he's sending him off to be crucified, and that's going to take a little while. The flogging is right now. And Mark is showing Pilate as directly responsible for it, and it doesn't mean Pilate had to lift up the whip himself. So that, I think, is what stands out to me most about this, that Pilate is pretty heavily implicated by Mark already with the flogging. Also, it's a crucifixion, of course. I mean, Pilate could have released Barabbas. So, but this is just a detail that even, if we expect this historically, it really stands out, at least to me, as I think about Pilate and his role in this. He has gone pretty quickly from sounding like he's defending Jesus, where he says, why, what evil has he done? And now, just within the span of a verse, he's physically abusing, torturing Jesus. Just a remarkable turn. And this, like I said, it's fascinated and confused and probably frustrated interpreters for 2,000 years to understand this. Certainly an interesting study, to say the least, in human behavior. But back to the translation itself, I think having him flogged is the way to do it, turned him over to be crucified, and then that sets up what's going to happen next. I'm going to stop there and see if you've got questions or comments on verse 15. Yeah, and here's a comment. I'll just do kind of a content warning on the graphic nature of this comment coming now, because of course it's a graphic thing, but this comment is, isn't fragilosas a much more severe Roman action than flogging, which uses flat cords or sticks? Scourging is akin to flailing, cutting to the muscles, tendons, and bones. Yeah, I think there's a question here. I mean, I think that's right, and I think flogged may not do anything in translation. I think it was, I'm trying to remember which translations had scourged. Yeah, ASV has it, the CNT has it, New King James has it, ESV has scourged. So yeah, that's, I think, kind of the question that goes along with that comment then is, how do I bring this out in translation? It's similar to the word crucify. I mean, part of the question is how graphic do you want to be? And by the way, that's not a question of modern sensibilities. This goes back to translations of the Hebrew Bible and even euphemisms that are used. So in translation, I mean, flogged is one option, but if you look at this word more, you certainly could bring this out more specifically if you desired to. But yes, to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I think that's right, that we're talking about a pretty severe penalty here. You can see the NET note here. The word is excruciating, and the details are here in the post. One interesting comment here in this note is, many people who received such a beating died as a result. So even though we're going to get more interaction with Jesus on the way to his death, Pilate is essentially, I mean, one read of this is that Pilate is kind of murdering him right now, or risking it. I mean, he's just turning him over to something that could already be deadly. So yeah, Pilate does not come out very well in this passage, to say the least. We'll move on next time to Jesus is mocked. Next week, of course, being Thanksgiving week, I do not imagine that we're going to have a webinar. I'm not 100% sure about that yet. Just keep an eye on your email, but typically I do webinars Wednesdays and Thursdays, and with Thanksgiving coming up, I think we won't have them those days, but we'll pick back up as soon as we can with the rest of chapter 15. Let me know if you've got any more questions or comments. We've got just another moment. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and stay on for a minute. So if you're watching the recording, again, tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes has a link to this handout, and you can email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com.